Well, what a day this is, everybody. Welcome aboard to the first episode of a brand new podcast called Liftoff, where we lift the lid off the box marked space and just talk about really cool stuff which isn't talked about enough. Over the next 8 episodes, you're going to hear from lots of really interesting people. You'll see lots of it being posted over social media, and hopefully you'll share it with your space chums as well. But today's very first episode, I'd like to welcome to the space station. We have a range of guests and a couple of people who are joining remotely because there's problems actually getting up to the space station itself. But if I could just first introduce our guests, and then we're going to be talking about the benefits of space. Are we failing to communicate? So on my left, I have the wonderful Dr. Louise Butt, who heads up Space South Central, and we'll be hearing more from the work that Louise is doing, accompanied by Dr. Bob Mello from Prometheus Sensing. Bob, I'm really looking forward to hear about the stuff you're doing. And then joining us remotely, we have a splendid selection of guests. We have Derek Harris from Skyrora, all the way up in the Shetlands. Very fine rocket in the background, Derek. I'm looking to hear more about that as well. And then finally, but by no means least, we have the wonderful Chris White-Horne, Deputy CEO of the UK Space Agency. So without further ado, let's blast off and lift off into the wonderful world of space with Liftoff. So let's start up by putting some questions out to everybody. Chris, you've been with the agency now for about 18 months now. Tell us about what your experiences are, and I suppose in many respects, what have you learned about the benefits of space?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for having us on the program. I've been really stunned and impressed as I come into the space sector. I wasn't a space expert before. I've spent most of my career in defence and military aviation, a small sojourn in the railway network, and then came to space. I had no idea quite how space underpins the way of life that we enjoy in our country and across the world. So I think, firstly, I've learned a lot about what those benefits are, and I'm sure we can go on and talk about those in the programme. But the idea of communicating them and getting them across to people, I didn't know. And I considered myself to be a reasonably educated, technologically aware person. So I've been very surprised at how much space underpins our way of life. And I've been surprised that we haven't been able to do a better job of communicating those to the public and to politicians and to funders and to potential investors and so on. So I think it's a real challenge, but it's been an amazing experience. I haven't got to visit the International Space Station yet, but I have got to visit some amazing places, met some incredible people. And the other thing I'm really struck with a year and a bit into my role is just how great some of the people are who work in space, that enthusiasm for what they do and their ability to articulate what they do to others is just incredible. So it's been a real pleasure, as you can hopefully tell from how I'm talking about it.
I think you made a really important point there, actually, about the passion. And I've been working in this sector now for just under 2 years now, and it's the most exciting part of my career to date. And what strikes me most is that people actually talk to each other and want to share ideas. In other industries, etc., people are more not secretive or uncooperative, but in space, it's anything goes, really. Let's look around. You guys have all come from slightly different backgrounds, etc., longer periods within the space itself. Obviously, we'll come back to hear from Bob's experiences, Derek's experiences, pardon me, with the fast growth of Skyrora, and there's obviously some exciting things happening there soon. What's your perspective over the time you've been in the space sector, Louis?
Wow. I've been in the space sector for about 6-7 years now. My background actually is in life science. So like Chris, had a kind of broad view around technologies, regard myself as pretty well educated, but likewise, when you join the space sector, it's absolutely amazing the variety of technologies, of opportunities, the types of missions and what they can deliver, whether it's things around climate change and net zero, whether it's time stamping of financial transactions. There's such a broad range, and in the space sector, we have a really good understanding of that, but we don't do a particularly great job of advocating outside of our industry, if I'm honest.
It's almost a very great British trait of the understatement.
Absolutely.
And Bob, from your perspective as a space startup, just very quickly, in terms of the conversation here, tell us a bit about Prometheus Sensing.
We're looking at using data from satellites, particularly in the infrared range, and detecting and managing that whole wildfire life cycle, which is obviously a much bigger problem now than it's ever been in the past. And because of the developments in space and space technology, we're able to extract a lot more information in a much more timely manner. And I think we can really make a big difference to how fast and how we respond, how effectively we respond to these events.
And here we are at the end of January here now. It's where the month has gone, I haven't a clue, according to my diary. But the terrible fires in California, is the work you're doing potentially have a direct impact on that capability?
Absolutely, that's exactly the sort of fires that we want to target. And as with a lot of these things, we're seeing that with California. They've grown to such a size that we can't just go in and extinguish them. The best we can do is contain them and manage them and try and keep the people safe. And our company is entirely focused around detecting those fires really early once they start and managing them then before they can get to these big conflagrations that are just out of control.
There's a whole conversation, a whole series I can see just on that particular issue itself. And I'm talking to one of my colleagues about the upcoming series, and he said, well, why can't we talk for hours on this and hours on that? So, well, we haven't the time. But we'll talk offline about that very much. I'd like to actually bring in Derek, actually, because Derek, you're up in the Shetlands at the moment, actually. What's the weather like today?
Actually, quite nice. Blue skies, a little bit windy, but just what you would expect up in Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely. And so from Skyrora's perspective, it's been a very rapid journey, hasn't it? Well, in terms of coming into the public eye. Tell us a bit about your journey into space.
So I think the most impressive thing is within 7 years, we've managed to go from design and building up to testing. Sorry about that. So we've done one suborbital test of the Skylark R vehicle, L vehicle, out of Shetland in 2022, and hopefully look to deliver another one out of Shetland this year, once the licenses have been approved. So it's a very rapid development from R&D to delivery, which is something you don't really see elsewhere, which I think the UK is very much in a prime position for when it comes to space.
And in terms of how Skyrora communicates with the broader public, and I know we're talking about the benefits of space, but this is a very good example. In the past, when we look about public relations, etc., we see the great behemoth that is NASA and the way they promote themselves. How has Skyrora gone about promoting itself as one of the deliveries of space benefits, I suppose?
I think we've been trying to be very active. What we've seen is we have pretty much an undiscovered gem of an industry within the UK. The UK has always had a lot of space background, whether you go all the way back to Black Arrow and beyond that. But you've had companies building satellites, SSTL, Spire, Clyde Space, which really have shown how the UK's went from shipbuilding to spaceship building, spacecraft building in this regards. So it's something we have actually been doing. Said it's not really filtered through to the general public. So for myself and the company, what we started was a grassroots. So we make sure we do a huge amount of STEM events, attend science festivals, but also just try and interact with other sectors. So Scotland has another sector, you may have heard of it, the whisky sector. So when we were looking at environmental, we sort of engaged with them to find out about how they tackled their environmental issues. So it's about trying to bring in other sectors as well, so that our story can go a bit wider than it is at the moment.
I had a thought, space whiskey. Are we going to be seeing some bottles going up on the first launch?
Certainly, if we can get away with it, I'm sure there'll be a few shared after the first launch.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll put my name down for one of those, or possibly two. I just want to talk, perhaps move the conversation forward a little bit, and how we engage with the public. From my perspective, I've been involved in various events over the last couple of years. And if you're in the club, you're in the club. And I'm not saying that we see the same people on a regular basis, and we all congratulate ourselves, nice to see you again, etc. And you go to the various space shows which have been popping up like mushrooms over the last 6 months. How do you think we can open this up to a broader audience, and this obviously to Chris and to Derek as well? How would you like to do it? I'm giving you a blank piece of paper, everybody. So Lou.
Well, certainly we need some kind of really strategic coordination.
Yeah.
That goes without saying. I mean, I think generally in the UK, we're kind of very reliant on this kind of passive behaviours that, individual companies, individual universities are going to communicate what they're doing because it's great and it's exciting.
Yeah.
And that's fantastic. But when we look across the pond and we look at the likes of NASA, you have that kind of coordinating entity, which has part of its remit, since the 50s about disseminating the value of what it does and talking about space and space missions to the public, to foster that kind of interest. And we don't quite have that coordinating body. The UK Space Agency plays a major role in terms of kind of policy and in terms of the link with delivering part of the government's agenda, but it isn't an entity that's really focused on that coordination of comms and public engagement and consistent education. And I think there's some changes that need to happen.
As with all great conversations, Chris, I think it's only fair that I ask you to come up to the speaker and discuss what Lou's very eloquently put across.
One of our core purposes is what we call championing space. And it's exactly what was just being discussed there. The challenge, of course, is one of scale. We're not NASA, we're much smaller than that. When we look at what engages the public on space, and if you go right back to Derek talked about primary schools and working with school kids, what 5-year-old doesn't like talking about astronauts? The same with like dinosaurs. And I think the problem is astronauts and dinosaurs always go together. They're amazing, they're fascinating, people can talk about them. But people don't necessarily feel a connection. Astronauts are so very different to what your 5-year-old's life experience is and how you bridge that gap. So when we look at what cuts through, what does the public like to see about space? Well, just cast your mind back over the last year or so. What have you seen on the news that was amazing about space? Most people would probably say the SpaceX capturing of the returning launcher, for example. So rockets definitely do it. Get on Skyrora because you've got one of the hot topics. Astronauts do it, and when Tim Peake flew to the International Space Station, the UK Space Agency ran a whole year's lead-in program there around outreach and so on. We are very excited to have UK astronauts. We've got Rosemary, who's now trained. We have actually, as we're speaking, John McFall and McGann in training in the European Space Agency as well. These are properly inspirational people, and particularly John, who hopefully will become the world's first astronaut with a disability, the opportunity to use that to inspire young people and across society about space, and also the opportunity that even someone with a physical disability can fly to space. So that's the second thing. And the third thing that really cuts through is some space exploration activities. So pictures from the James Webb Space Telescope, those awesome images, those iconic images of those nebulae and so on that you either saw from Hubble or now James Webb. These are the things that we need to major on and then build a bridge from those things into people's lived reality. So when I go out and I do a lot of talking about space to groups in the public, I always start with put your hand up if you've used space today. And maybe a third of the audience will put their hand up because they think about GPS and they're using Google Maps or Apple Maps or whatever. But then you go on to financial transactions. Did you see a weather forecast today? Well, if you did, almost inevitably, those big models which the Met Office run are fed by data from space. Climate change, that was mentioned a little bit earlier on, 2/3 of the variables that you need to fight the climate emergency have to come from space. You have to observe the planet from afar. Ubiquitous telecommunications, which is now becoming such a game changer, and how you can take digital communications to remote areas, even in the UK, but certainly in sub-Saharan Africa and so on. So I think for me, it's about building that bridge, but to take the challenge head on. Yeah, the UK Space Agency, we do try to champion space, but we need a collective effort across the ecosystem of space in the UK. And so it's fab to hear what Derek and others are doing as well. It's a team effort, right?
So, but Derek, if I could pass the question over to you actually as well.
Yeah, thank you. So, some really interesting points that that have been raised there. I think one of the big challenges though that we have is space is still seen as quite esoteric, and as Chris was talking, you know, it's images from James Webb, it's astronauts.
I was going to say there's a real disconnect there between that and then the things that we're then talking about in terms of those benefits. Yeah. There's a total mismatch.
Absolutely, and I think it's really important that we actually start promoting the variety of careers that people can get into in the space sector, and the paths for them to get there. And that, for me, that starts now with education. You know, there's no secondary school or college courses in space. Alton College are putting one together, so they're doing a space module. Their students will come out with A levels in physics, maths and engineering, but nothing on their CV says space. And I think we really need to make those career paths obvious and available for people to understand where they can contribute. They don't have to go up into space themselves. There's an enormous amount of work in legal, financial, engineering, regulatory, all those other disciplines that we think about to contribute to the space sector.
And the reality is that, you know, you're absolutely right, that most people will not become an astronaut. In fact, you know, that isn't even a career. The career is a pilot, generally speaking, you know, a jet pilot, and then they move into and transition across into being an astronaut. It's not really a bona fide career. And so we need to do much, much better at illustrating that variety of much more tangible and real opportunities that exist.
This is very interesting because here we are on the first episode, and if you go to our the landing page on our website, links will be provided after the show, you'll see the full agenda for the first series, and we've got a very interesting setup coming on skill shortage in the space sector, but also how do you encourage Generation Alpha, you know, the 14-year-olds, the 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds to get into space. And it's not all about shiny suits and magnetic boots, as I tell people. It's about the downstream side of it, is the biggest side of the market. We need space plumbers, we need space marketing people, we need space business development people. Derek, from your perspective, up in Shetland, how have you found that, for example, getting people to engage with Skyrora, picking up on the themes which everybody's been talking about here?
We've got rockets. Nothing's more sexy in the industry than a rocket. Everyone wants to be there. It's kind of like when you say astronaut, it's one of those headline terms. So it's an easy for us to get in there in the gateway. What I'm seeing is, if I'm honest, is a change of attitudes kind of needed from the press. We've had some great programs ran by the Space Agency when they took around the rocket from Virgin up and down the country. Though the press decided, well, that was fine, but they wanted to go on the negative side of things, that the mission, in their eyes, wasn't a success. Or even the most recent test of RFA up in Shetland, that it was an explosion, so this wasn't a success. Whereas, actually, I hate this term, but space is hard. What we're seeing is all of these developments, which is actually a step towards launch. It steps towards a successful launch-faring nation. So we need to be actually trying to get the press to celebrate this. So going back to the James Webb, for example, lovely images. Some of that was built by the teams out of Edinburgh University. You've got the mission, Bepi Colombo, for example. Susie Imber, I think, she'll shoot me if I get this wrong. I think she's at Loughborough, but she had a huge amount to do with that project and still does. So all of these projects, you have these hidden stars that could also be icons up there with McGann and such as well, and Tim Peake, to actually show roles that can get day-to-day people into the industry. I think Bob said there's not a huge amount of courses. I've actually came across one up in Scotland with Fife College that is now offering, I think it's a year-long course on data analysis for Earth observation data. And this is for basically fresh out of high school, to give them a foothold to try and get into the industry, because these sort of data analysts in this area is huge amount of jobs going. So it's highlighting, I think, the jobs that are available, as said, but making sure you don't need to be a rocket scientist, you don't need to be an astronaut. I would bite your hand off for a welder or a couple of technicians at the moment, because at the moment space is more of a slow-growing industry. The problem that we're finding from that skills point of view is, if you've got one of the sort of a rocket or an astronaut, you've got that pull factor, but when you're fighting against the oil and gas sector in Scotland specifically for these sort of people to join us. So it's making them aware of this is an up-and-coming industry as well, but celebrating the successes not just of launches and of astronauts, but of all the data and everything alongside that. So that's really where I'm seeing that. And I think the press has to also take a little bit of this on their shoulders, because all they want to report is a negative outlay with that, rather than the successes that they should be cheering us on for.
Thanks for that, Derek. I'd like to move the conversation on in a couple of minutes to some more broader subjects, but we are 6 months into the new government, etc. Chris, have you noticed any change in the attitude, the relationships between central government and the UK Space Agency, and how the sense of cooperation are moving forward?
Well, I have noticed a change, and that's a positive thing, because actually what's been quite consistent between the previous government and the one we now have is a strong support for what we're doing in space, and a recognition that it's quite simple. Our way of life on Earth now depends on space. We have to engage with this subject, and I think we have to engage with it in a way which is beneficial for society, that drives economic growth, all the things that the new government say are very important to them. Look at their missions and see how space docks into those missions. So I think there's actually a really positive future for space. I think the challenge that we and so many other parts of government and the science and technology sector have got is there is miles more ambition and capability than there is government resources to back it. You can see the news, you can see the challenges that the new government have got balancing the books and working out where best to invest. We have to make the very best case for space, why a taxpayer's pound invested in a space company or in a space activity, what value that brings. We have a good story, but so does the pharmaceutical industry, so does the quantum world, so does the people doing AI, and so many other things that I could mention as well. So I think there's various elements of that relationship, but what I can tell you is that the ministers and the government people that we work with are very clear on the benefits that space brings to this country, and that is recognised. I think that's the fundamental starting point. But actually, when you bring those two things together, what the public think and what politicians think and how they act, of course, are intimately connected. So I think one of our challenges is also to join this up and say, actually, if the public understand and know that they need this, the country needs this, how can we then translate that into policy and to ministerial direction to agencies like us? Essentially, we work under the direction of the government. So no, I am positive and optimistic about the future. There's challenges, but there always are.
And I suppose the question, I put my slightly negative hat on here, or drawn this out, are we too dependent on space? I mean, are we putting all our eggs in our one basket? Are there alternatives for doing what we're doing, the use of data, etc.?
Any nation, has to try and build up resilience. So you're gonna want different kind of ways to gather data. But the reality is that space, satellite infrastructure is classed as critical national infrastructure. So we're too far down the track.
Yeah.
And in an ever more challenging global landscape, we're already seeing kind of the behaviours of other nations in terms of how they use space, and more dialogue, I think, around the importance of it from a kind of military and defence element as well, which again we don't really as a nation talk about particularly. So I mean, in my area as a space cluster, we've got companies that are contributing towards building Skynet, so that the UK sovereign satellite system. We've got SSTL, for example, who built and launched Tyche, which was UK Space Command's first operational satellite. That was last year. And again, so there's a whole element here around kind of that defence and national sovereignty piece that we also don't really talk about. And so I think that's going to be an increasingly important angle that we need, both from a political kind of will, but also, from the public's point of view. The other thing I'd like to kind of add is, and I agree totally with Derek's point around the role of the media, and I think part of the challenge is actually how it gets absorbed by what's happening in America with your billionaire behaviours, overshadowing, all the good stuff that happens in the UK. So that's something else we kind of need to consider and tackle.
Yeah, so we can't ignore, but we do need to be mindful of the musk in the room, you're saying. That's fascinating. I mean, Bob, from your perspective, we're talking about here, what's your view on it?
I actually think we're underusing space at the moment. We're talking about it, and it is a hugely growing sector. But I think we've got to view space as an environment as well, much like as communications and telephone took off. All those undersea and transatlantic cables were fascinating, but that really focused all of that communication in that area. I think space is allowing us to diversify and just bring some robustness into how we do our day-to-day business. We now have transatlantic cables and satellites, so one can back up the other. And I think as well, the other aspect I'd like to pick up on that is whether we are developing systems for space or not, we are still subject to space weather from the sun. And we've already seen some severe effects from that. I think as we become a world that's more heavily reliant on technology, we're going to be more susceptible. And if we're not looking at space and not exploring that environment, all we're doing is putting our eggs into one basket and making ourselves more vulnerable, and almost blinding ourselves, I think. So I think we have to move more into that area.
And of course, Derek, with your own great work up in the Shetlands, you're giving us that, is it the right, sovereign control, or I'm not quite sure how to best describe it, giving the UK capacity to actually get stuff up there on our own.
Yeah, certainly. We've always aimed to be agile and adaptive for that purpose. Thus, the mobile launch that we carried out in Iceland was a test of that capability to try and bring that to the UK. But I think what you're actually seeing within the space sector, and I think Chris can probably agree and give a bit more to this, is the technology is actually a linchpin that comes forward. If you go back historically, it brings out technologies like the MRI, things like this. What I think you're going to see is the satellite data, the sensors are going to start working hand in hand with machine learning and AI. I think you're already seeing that from a defense point of view. When you look at the war in Ukraine, for example, these sort of technologies are being used alongside satellite data to track big movements of troops or armored convoys and things like this. So I think it's a bit of an underestimation on actually what space does bring to the normal sectors and all the other sectors as well. It is a bit of a technology bleed. And given the fact that the UK will now have that holistic ability to build, produce its satellites, bring the data in and launch all in one legal jurisdiction, is, from a commercial point of view, but also from the defence point of view, just an unbelievable opportunity.
And that's really good. You just very nicely led into my next question, which is going to be, here we are talking about space amongst ourselves, and we're all slightly on the nerd scale when it comes to this. What about making availability and making access and exposure to non-space related businesses? I mean, Chris alluded to at the very beginning of this particular episode about the importance of downstream data, etc. But could we be doing things better in this particular aspect, Lou?
There's certainly been some initiatives. The Space Agency have had Unlocking Space for Business, where they've looked at particular sector opportunities and tried to do some of that engagement. So we were involved with some of the activities around the marine and maritime industry, which is a really mature market for space technologies. SATCOM, GNSS, and that whole space data piece. Logistics sector. So we know there's all these kind of user groups, but again, some of it, and certainly in my experience, is helping them be able to use that information in a meaningful way. Often, the non-space sector doesn't know what data's there, how to access it, how easy it is to download it, to manipulate it, process it. So there's some work to do around that as well. Which then breeds opportunities, particularly for companies, like Prometheus.
And of course, with the relationship between, obviously, got Chris's department, the agency, doing their strategic work, and obviously with the regional power of the clusters are pivotal to the future of the UK space economy.
I think they have a really, really important role to play because different regions have different kind of sector focuses. Some might be really strong in life science, some might be really, really strong in offshore wind, for example. So you need to be able to have those clusters kind of operate the interface between space and these adjacent industries and beneficiaries to really maximise kind of the economic value of space.
And if I could just flip the question back to you, Chris, because we're talking at sort of a national strategic level, and obviously the regional collaboration from Lou's side at Space South Central and the other clusters as well. How is the agency working with non-space businesses, and are there overt strategies in place to address that?
The Unlocking Space programme that was just mentioned is exactly trying to do that. And we're trying to move away from this idea that, Derek, if you just excuse me for a minute, a space company is not necessarily one who makes rockets. That's part of the ecosystem. But that notion of downstream exploitation, and particularly of data, particularly Earth observation data, is one where that's where we see the future. I think there are niches for the UK in what we call upstream technology, so everything from launchers to building satellites and so on. And we've got some really strong capabilities. But the opportunity space, I think, is in downstream. So that's why we run our Unlocking Space programme. We're looking at with businesses to how to open the eyes of companies to the opportunities that space data brings. And allied to that is also opening the eyes of investors. So Derek used the term, and I don't like it either, by the way, that space is hard. But if you are a venture capital investor or a pension fund investor, do you want to invest in a rocket company? Well, the rocket might blow up. I'll see my investment going up in smoke in front of my eyes. It's not seen as an easy or safe investment. And I think part of what we're trying to do as well is to almost debunk that myth that space has to be rockets and it's difficult and dangerous. It is both of those things, but well managed, it can be a really good investment as well. We're also looking across government, because government is a huge consumer of data. We touched very briefly on agriculture earlier and land use. I was in Egypt just before Christmas at an African and Arab space event, and I met the Egyptian remote sensing centre and went to visit them. They are doing some really impressive things to try and understand their own agricultural economy and how the land in Egypt, and particularly that the fertile bit of Egypt, is used intrinsically using space from the start. And I think we can do more across the UK government and all the various public sector bodies. I said I came to this job from the railways. You can use space to detect the first signs of landslips, which might ultimately lead to train lines being made unusable. We're doing some work on remote islands off the coast of Northern Ireland to bring internet connectivity, climate change, weather forecasting. There's just a mass of data which the government consumes. But a lot of my colleagues in government don't understand. They probably don't even know, or do they even need to know, that the data they're using has come from a satellite. They don't consider themselves space experts, and nor should they be. So the analogy I use, I come from the aviation sector. I think space feels a bit like aviation probably did back in the 1930s. So imagine Heathrow as a green field with some marquees and tents where you turned up to go on your flight. Imagine a world without air traffic control, without regulated international activity in air, with technology that was pretty risky and, let's face it, occasionally went wrong. Think about airships in the 1930s. Space feels like that, and I think what we need to do is to turn space from today into what now the way that aviation is today, which is just ubiquitous. And we don't have conversations about you can only work in the air travel industry if you're a pilot. So why are we still talking about astronauts? You don't have conversations about you can only work in an airline if you understand jet engines. So why are we only talking about rockets? And I think we need to move space into being a ubiquitous part of our society. on the same journey that aviation has gone over the last, century plus, but really since the 1930s and 40s, when you saw that explosion in air travel. I think you're going to see that in space.
So, Derek, from your perspective up in the Shetlands, the sheep won't bat an eyelid when the umpteenth rocket goes up. Is that the case?
Pretty much. Our actual test stand for our engines is on the outskirts of Edinburgh, and it's in an old quarry surrounded by farmland in a land that's actually used for sort of hunting pheasants and things by a local estate. And the animals don't bat an eyelid when the engines test. We've done this. We've brought in environmental people to check this out and things. But I think, as Chris says, I always tend to try and avoid the word explosion and rockets together. But the way that the industry is going forward, investors should be aware that data is there, for example. So my historical background is actually I worked in finance as well, is that I think it's every pound invested into downstream data for our engines is on the outskirts of Edinburgh. And it's in an old quarry surrounded by farmland in a land that's actually used for But as Chris rightly says, what we're seeing is they look at the more technological and money-intensive side of things when they're looking at these investments. So it is about pushing the full story of all the sectors around within there, so upstream, downstream, and sort of getting those success stories out, because the UK is full of them. And if I'm honest, at the moment, it's one of the most undiscovered gems. And I know I've worked with some of my old colleagues in the investment side to try and pinpoint a few companies to a few old friends that could be worth looking into. So as Chris says, I think it's an image problem at the moment, I believe.
I'm just thinking the image of a rocket sitting in a quarry on the outskirts of Edinburgh, pardon me. You've got the ultimate Hogmanay firework there.
Yeah, certainly. Thankfully, it's only the engines that you can see. There's no actual body with the rest of it. But we've been there for about 3 years now, and I think the biggest thing for us is it's allowed us to integrate with the local communities. So again, we've went into all the local schools in and around the area, done tours around the site, and we occasionally put out video footage from it to try and help that education piece. But yeah, unfortunately, when it goes wrong, it isn't as impressive as you would expect. It's more just a pop or something like that you tend to hear in a few minutes and a few seconds even, and then the sort of fire extinguishers go off and it's all over. So it's not as impressive. I always think it's a bit of an anticlimax when you look at it.
But judging from the pictures of when the Saxiford, I won't say explosion, but the learning experience, the rocket testing last year. I mean, there must have been a lot of frightened seagulls when that happened. But let's move on from there, perhaps. I want to talk about the human side of communicating benefits of space now, really. When I was growing up, back in the 70s, so that does age me. For me, the benefits of space were the Teflon frying pan, and you could get that really cool NASA Barrow pen, which would write underwater and upside down.
Don't forget memory foam mattresses.
And memory foam mattresses, yes, and which are still NASA space technology, isn't it? Only yesterday I saw an advert where they talk about NASA space technology, and I had in mind the cooling suits which Neil Armstrong would wear, pumping water, and that same technology for trickling away heat is being used today. But let's talk about the human side, the stories. We've got 4 different perspectives here, and it's really cool. How would you best, in an ideal world, like to promote the human side of space?
I think certainly we need to engage with some of the other channels that exist. And for a very technological sector, we aren't very good at adopting all of the technologies that are available to us to communicate to those human stories. I mean, we've talked about kind of young people, but they consume their information in a very different way than even I mean, my son's 20 soon, giving away my age, but even he consumes information differently from the generation that's now coming through, and so thinking about TikTok and Snapchat and all these different types of channels to get information. We really need to be engaging with those, and I don't think like I said, that coordinating body doesn't exist, so we don't have ways to do that, and then it becomes quite burdensome on a sector that's got a lot of small companies who don't necessarily have the resources available to them to be able to engage with all those different channels. So, we need to think very, very creatively about how we do this.
And Bob, from your perspective, great stuff from Prometheus Sensing, the start of the journey. How do you go about invigorating, exciting people about the company?
And it is a big challenge. I think for us, we are a space tech company, but we have to sell ourselves on the benefits to other people. In the what we sometimes jokingly refer to as the Whiffam test, what's in it for me? Yeah. And that's I loved your point earlier. We are all on that nerd scale to various degrees, but we almost need to separate ourselves from our pure excitement of the technology and start selling those benefits and engaging people in, look, this is what it can do for you. And some of that's around the cost-benefit models, how we can add to it. Chris's analogy of the aviation in the 1930s, I thought was fantastic, because we are very much like that, and it was really seen as quite exclusive and not really particularly practical. And actually, it built very quickly. People started seeing what else they could do with it, moving people around, moving goods around. The military side, the defence sector, really picked up on that, and it was those benefits, selling those benefits to people, what it could do for them, that I think really gave it the impetus and the drive to grow into that large sector. And that's what we need to do as a space sector at the moment, to get that, to build that investment, as Chris was talking about, and to engage a wider community of users, start selling it on the benefits to them and how it can help them.
It's interesting because benefits. It's not. We talk about not about rockets. It's about the downstream, how it impacts on everybody. Chris, from your perspective at the UKSA, are there initiatives you'd like to see to be introduced which will broaden the communication, broaden the messages out to the more general public?
I think you hit on a really important point, Bruce, when you asked the question about the human aspect of this, and it just strikes me that people relate much better to human stories. There's always going to be a segment of the audience who loves the technology and will just lap up anything about the next super cool bit of kit. But actually, we use the term space for everyone, and it's an area we really want to develop this year, and it's got sort of several different meanings, space for everyone. I actually want to correct something that was said earlier on about astronauts being test pilots and having a military aviation background. Look at our 3 UK astronauts today. John McFall, Paralympic sprinter, orthopaedic surgeon. McGann Christian, who's a climate scientist and spent some time in Antarctica studying atmospheric physics. And Rosemary Coogan, who's got a PhD and a postdoc research background in galaxy evolution. We're moving away from the sort of the right stuff, close-cropped hair, 1960s American fighter pilot into a very different sort of astronaut. So how do we use those human stories to say space really is for everybody? And to Derek's point he made earlier on about his background, this is not just about physics and astrophysics students moving into careers making rockets and designing space instruments. We need finance people, we need business people, we need really good communications people. We have an awesome comms team in the UK Space Agency who do an incredible job getting the message out about space. They are comms specialists first and they are space people second. So we want to do more on this message of space being for everyone. It's ubiquitous. But I think the more we can do to come up with those relatable human stories, the more penetration and cut through we're going to get. The tech angle works to a level, but it's not enough because there are lots of other industries that got really cool technology they can talk about. But actually those human relatable stories, I think, are the ones we ought to be making more of.
And Derek, from your perspective up in with Skyrora, tell us a little about sort of the engagement you have with the general public in terms of schools, public events, etc.
Yeah, I think one of the largest things I try and highlight is sort of diversity within the team and how it sort of came together. Following on from what Chris said, sort of, obviously you've got my background. We've had members of the team that have now moved on, so two that jumped to mind. One went on and started the first marketing company, which really concentrates with space, Astro Agency, and it's become very successful since its creation around from when COVID happened, and it's helping other space companies get their message out. But from an actual personal people perspective, I love to highlight our graduate apprentices that we've got as well. So we've got the first one that we had came through, is completed, and is now one of the most experienced people building rockets in the Europe, basically, because of this. We've had members of staff who came from being at Glasgow University, graduated, spent 3 years with us, that have now been headhunted and are living a gloriously sunshine and warm life over in New Zealand, working for Rocket Lab. So it opens up a huge career opportunity and pathway for some people. And this can be something as simple as I said earlier, welders. These skill sets just aren't very well expected as something you would need in the space industry. So being able to highlight these people within my company, it's great. I feel like a cheerleader for that one, going around saying, well, look at what these guys do. And these are the roles that you could have. What does that do? Well, it helps bring this back to your day-to-day life. This is the careers that you can do. And if you look at some of the stories within the team, we've got people who were told that to get a job as a bricklayer or go and work in McDonald's and things like this because they didn't think they would be suitable for any other careers. And now we've got people who had that said to them, heading up departments, making engines or doing the trajectory analysis. So it's that outlook. I agree with Chris, it's really highlighting the people that we need to do here, because people look up to people. There's always someone else with a bit of fancy tech, but if you get the right people highlighted out there, the sector will start to shine.
Thanks for that, Derek. Well, we're coming to the end of episode 1, but I've got my favourite question. It's the wish list question, and what are you most looking forward to? So 2025 is coming to the end. It's actually just started. I've got a problem with time travel on this series, by the way, and you'll see this as we go through it. But what are you most looking forward to, everybody, for 2025? And what would you like to see?
Oh, wow.
The known and the unknown.
I'm looking a little bit further ahead than 2025.
Okay, that's good.
So one of the things I'm quite excited by is Truths. So because it's a UK-led mission, it involves an awful lot of UK companies. You know, Teledyne, Airbus. There's a whole range of both industry and UK academia involved in that. It's a mission that focuses on climate standards, so it's going to be really, really fantastically useful for the whole kind of downstream piece as well. And that's set to launch, I think, in 2029, so we should be getting data from that by 2030. Yeah. So, essentially homegrown mission that's going to change the world.
So when we come back in Series 8, or slightly older and greyer, we can look at the work of that particular operation. That's cool. Bob, from your perspective, what's the future and what would you like to see?
I think and it really is an interesting question. It's always hard to predict what's going to happen, but I think there's a number of companies out there that have really novel ideas, and particularly with in-space manufacture, and we know that, I'm sure you'll cover this in another episode, but we know that space has got a lot of debris from our past activity there. So that big focus now on trying to clean that up, and understanding that environmental impact, not just on the planet, but on the near orbit and the wider orbit. And I think the excitement for me is foreseeing a lot of those future problems and bringing those solutions together, and watching new businesses and new business avenues open up, to really benefit the wider community, is where I think that we'll start seeing some progress from this year onwards, and that the excitement lives for me.
The excitement lives for me. That's a T-shirt in itself, isn't it? That's good. And Derek, busy year ahead, lighting the blue touch paper and retiring to a safe distance. What's happening for Skyrora this year?
Very much so. In the short term, I would say seeing a successful takeoff from Saxon this year by Skyrora. Medium term, definitely looking at the first full sovereign. So UK vehicle, UK launch site, UK satellite taking off from the UK. And then the long term is just celebrating everyone's successes here on the panel and the growth of the cluster, Prometheus growth, and obviously the success that Chris is bringing to the space agency.
And Chris, last but by no means least, your parting thoughts on what we've been talking about today and the future?
So perhaps I take a longer term view as well. I think it was touched on just now, sustainability. And I think the UK, we're really proud of what we do in the international community to be a bit of a thought leader around how we can protect the use of space, not just for us today, but for our children and our children's future. Working with the United Nations, raising awareness of the issues around things like space debris, but not just talking, doing practical things about it. And we're supporting companies who are developing the really tough technology to do things like active debris removal from space. We haven't talked much about space exploration, but I think I'm absolutely not going to try and get my crystal ball out and predict about what might happen in America. But I think a second Trump administration and the appointment of the new NASA administrator will result in a really interesting course being charted to the stars. I'm not going to quite point where it goes to, and we don't think that's a really fascinating area. And the UK has got some really strong contributions to make, both to the return of humans to the surface of the moon through the Artemis Accord and our relationship with NASA, but also on and beyond into interstellar exploration to Mars and so on. So we're really excited about that. And the last area I'll touch on is about science. We haven't talked so much about that today. We've talked a lot about business and growth, which is really important, but the science mission remains at the heart of what we do. It's not just really cool images from James Webb. The work that things like the Euclid mission is doing. We mentioned Truths. I'll add to that Vigil, which is going to be a satellite which sits out to the side of the sun and the earth and can observe solar flares and give early predictions of what we call space weather, and open up a whole range of solar related science. There are some incredibly exciting things. I think we should be unashamed about promoting the benefits of research that space brings, of understanding our own universe, and how we relate that to challenges back on Earth. So there is very, very much to be excited about, and we have lots of reasons to be cheerful. There'll be loads of challenges ahead, but we've got fantastic people in the space sector. We've got a really cool bunch in the space agency who are going to do their absolute best to bring this to life for the country.
I am staggered by where the last hour has gone. In the preparation for this, you pulled lots of stuff together, and we've barely scratched the surface of stuff we were talking about. I just want to say, firstly, thank you all very, very much for taking part in episode 1 of Liftoff. The perspectives, the challenges, the very polite disagreements, and have been really, really interesting. And I hope this will be echoed across the rest of the series. It goes without saying that sadly I must bring us to an end of episode 1 of Liftoff. I hope you've enjoyed it. Of course, you must like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Key things coming up in the next couple of weeks is Ignite Space taking place at the National Space Centre. This is going to be a great opportunity for anybody who's involved or not involved in the space business to come along and see what's happening. And in particular, the strong focus on the SME, the small business sector, getting involved within the space sector. So it's Bruce Poston from Liftoff saying goodbye to his space chums. See you in episode 2, and thank you very much for tuning in. Bye-bye.